The lights inside the debate hall flickered for half a second, long enough to sharpen the tension. The audience knew this wasn't going to be another scripted political show. This was going to be personal. Donald Trump leaned forward, pointing a finger across the stage, his tone sharp, his voice echoing with that old, familiar dominance. You came here playing a part, Ibrahim. But this isn't your play. This is America. We lead. You follow. Know your place. The room fell into a frozen hush. And then came Traoré. Still as stone, yet powerful in presence, he didn't rush. He let the silence sit, expand. Then, finally, he smiled. I built my own, he said. Calm. Crisp. Unbothered. The words didn't thunder, but they hit like a hammer. Not just in Trump's direction, but across the crowd, across the stream, into living rooms where people had expected a scolding. Instead, they saw a man who wouldn't bow. The moderators shifted nervously. One cleared his throat. Trump stared, stunned for just a flicker. It was rare anyone deflected his dominance with such control. But Traoré wasn't performing. This wasn't about America's show. This was about legacy. Ground. Power. What made it more uncomfortable for Trump was that Traoré wasn't angry. He wasn't reactive. That smile wasn't smug, it was sovereign. And somehow, that was more threatening. A whisper started from the crowd, barely audible. Did he just outlead Trump? Trump leaned back, jaw tight. The camera zoomed in on his eyes, calculating, rattled. And just like that, the tone of the night shifted. Trump had started it like a lion. But it was Traoré who now owned the arena. Trump wasn't used to being ignored. Especially not by someone the American press had branded a foreign agitator. But there Traoré stood, composed, hands folded, eyes locked, not on Trump, but on the audience. You think leadership is about applause, Traoré said. I think it's about standing when it's easier to kneel. A wave of murmurs broke through the crowd like a rising tide. Trump's brow furrowed. He leaned in, ready to interrupt, but Traoré continued, unshaken. You built towers. I built resolve. You built debt. I built dignity. The difference? Traoré paused, now turning directly to Trump. Your empire needs cameras. Mine needs no spotlight. The moderator tried to cut in, stammering about time limits, but even she couldn't redirect the room. All eyes were glued to the man from Ouagadougou, who had just dared to compare his grassroots legacy to Trump's billionaire stagecraft. Trump laughed, too loud and too forced. So what, you're a philosopher now? This is politics. You don't win hearts with poetry, you win with power. Traoré's response was a glance. Not a retort, not a counterattack, just a look. It said more than any speech. A kind of look that made you question whether your wealth was armor or a cage. In the front row, a retired U.S. general nodded slightly. That image didn't go unnoticed. On social media, the clip was already being clipped, captioned, and sent viral. Trump barked. Traoré didn't even flinch. A storm was building, but Traoré wasn't running from it. He was becoming it. By the time they cut to commercial, the room had changed. What started as Trump's domain, a stage he could dominate with volume and bravado, now felt like a chessboard. And Traoré? He was 3 moves ahead. Backstage, Trump's advisors scrambled. He's making you look like the past, one whispered. Trump's jaw tightened. Then let's remind him who owns the stage, he growled. Back on air, Trump didn't wait for a question. He turned straight to Traoré. You walk in here like some moral compass, he spat. But let's be honest, Burkina Faso wouldn't last a month without American aid. Traoré raised an eyebrow. The room stiffened. The moderator blinked, unsure whether to intervene. But Traoré leaned forward, slowly, deliberately. "Then take it," he said. Silence. "I'm not here to beg," Traoré continued, "I'm here to warn. The world is shifting. The alliances you take for granted are dissolving. And the days of handouts with conditions? Over." Trump scoffed. Big words from a man whose GDP can't match the Pentagon's lunch bill. "That's true," Traoré nodded. "But remind me, when did values start needing a price tag?" The audience burst into applause. Even those skeptical of Traoré found themselves nodding. It wasn't about economic size anymore. It was about something harder to measure, conviction. A producer backstage whispered into his headset, "We've never had engagement spikes like this mid-debate." Because while Trump raised his voice, Traoré raised the bar. And the question no one dared to ask aloud suddenly hovered in every mind watching. Had the future just outgrown its teacher? Trump leaned back in his chair, momentarily thrown. He was the man known for controlling rooms, derailing debates, turning policy into performance. But now, he was reacting. Traoré had shifted the axis. "You want to sound noble," Trump said, reaching for sarcasm, "but the truth is, we let you speak here. Without our media, you'd still be a local story." Traoré smiled faintly. "That's where you're wrong. You didn't let me speak. You just didn't silence me fast enough." The audience erupted, not with noise, but with alertness. Heads turned. Phones lifted. People started recording again. Traoré's calm had become contagious, and every sentence felt like it was chiseling something new into the political landscape. "Power," Traoré continued, "isn't just having the mic. It's knowing you don't need it." Trump tried to cut in, "Save the slogans, kid," but Traoré held up one hand. "When you barked, 'Know your place,'" he said, voice level, "you assumed I was still learning where I stood. I'm not." He turned slowly to face the crowd, scanning them. "I built my place. From dust. From war. From betrayal. And I built it with people, not permission." In the control room, a director muttered, "We're watching a legend write itself in real time." The American panelists looked frozen. Even those who had rolled their eyes when Traoré was introduced were now silent, listening. Watching. Trump, visibly irritated, waved his hand. "You think you're inspiring? This is still America. We're still the top." Traoré didn't blink. "Then act like it." That sentence hit harder than any shout. The line tore through layers of ego, nationalism, and assumption. It wasn't just a clapback, it was a mirror. For once, Trump had no comeback. And for the first time on American television, the world saw something rare, not a leader demanding space, but one who had already taken it without permission. There was a moment, brief, but undeniable, when even the cameras hesitated. Traoré sat motionless, his gaze steady. Trump blinked, looked at the moderator, then back at Traoré. No one said a word. Silence had fallen. Not because there was nothing to say, but because everyone was waiting to see if Trump would answer like a leader or lash out like a wounded king. Instead, Trump chuckled, forced, dry. "You're good with words. But words don't build nations. Action does." Traoré nodded once. "I agree. That's why I don't waste time repeating the past. I act." He leaned slightly forward, not as a threat, but as if confiding in the entire room. "You built empires with weapons, debt, and fear. We're building communities with memory, faith, and resistance." Trump's face tightened. "You think history bows to your ambition. But it bends toward courage. You just don't recognize it without applause." The moderator attempted to regain control, flipping to a planned question about energy policy. But the crowd wasn't ready. The moment had transcended debate formats. A college student in the audience whispered to her friend, "Did he just out America Trump?" Because this wasn't just a clash of policy, it was a war of posture. Trump brought dominance. Traoré brought defiance. One expected to be followed. The other made people want to follow. And that's when it happened. A standing ovation. Not everyone. But enough to make it awkward for those still seated. Trump didn't stand. He didn't clap. He stared at Traoré with the look of a man who realized the crowd he thought was his had shifted under him. Traoré didn't smile wide. He simply offered a soft nod, as if saying, "It's not personal. It's time." And in that moment, the world saw the difference between a man who needed the room, and one who commanded it by not needing anything at all. As the broadcast cut to a commercial break, the studio buzzed, not with rehearsed sound bites, but real whispers, darting glances, and unspoken questions. Producers looked at each other like they'd just aired a revolution. On Twitter, Traoré was already trending, above Trump, above the election itself. Backstage, campaign staffers scrambled. Trump's team debated whether to spin or attack. But no narrative could undo what millions had just witnessed. This wasn't a soundbite, it was a shift. Trump emerged from the stage with clenched fists and muttered curses. He hadn't been defeated in a policy exchange, he'd been outshined in the very theater he built. Meanwhile, Traoré stepped off the stage with no entourage, no notes, and no need for validation. A young journalist chased him down the hallway. "Sir, did you plan that final line, then act like it? Was it rehearsed?" Traoré didn't stop walking. "No," he said. "It was felt." Outside, the crowd wasn't chanting names, they were asking questions. College students, activists, independents, people who weren't supposed to care about a foreign leader were suddenly quoting him like a folk hero. In cafes across the U.S., old assumptions cracked. A retired veteran in Florida told his wife, "I don't agree with that guy's politics, but damn if he didn't hold his ground like a Marine." A black high school student in Atlanta uploaded a clip of Traoré's calm response with the caption, "This is what strength looks like. No yelling. No begging." It racked up 3 million views in hours. And in the heart of Washington, D.C., an aide to a Republican senator muttered under his breath, "We just gave him a global stage, and he didn't blink." Trump had hoped to belittle him. But Traoré didn't rise to the bait, he rose above it. And that's what made it lethal. The question no one wanted to ask, yet couldn't ignore, was echoing across the political spectrum. If he's not even American, why does he sound more like a leader than anyone we've got? The next morning, the White House didn't just wake up, it scrambled. Briefings were rescheduled. Emails flew across departments. Because what had started as a symbolic debate had become something else entirely. An international moment of reckoning. Traoré had done the unthinkable, he had walked into the American political arena and walked out without bowing, apologizing, or losing himself in Western approval. And worse, for some, he had walked out respected. CNN, Fox, MSNBC, each scrambled to frame the event in their narrative. But clips of Traoré's calm dismantling of Trump were flooding TikTok, Instagram, even YouTube Shorts, repackaged by influencers who had no interest in geopolitics just 24 hours ago. A viral headline read, "One spoke with power. The other just spoke." Inside Mar-a-Lago, Trump was fuming. "They're making a hero out of him," he barked. "A nobody." An aide nervously corrected, "Sir, he's the president of Burkina Faso." "I don't care." Trump snapped. "He humiliated me on my turf." But the damage had already been done, and Traoré hadn't needed to shout once. In fact, that was what scared many the most. He had sat in Trump's storm, unmoved. He had let the noise collapse around him. And when he spoke, it wasn't to fight, it was to reveal. Across the Atlantic, African leaders noticed. A message from a West African diplomat quietly circulated. Traoré has made himself a symbol. Not of rebellion, but of sovereignty. Back in Ouagadougou, young men painted murals overnight. One read. Respect is not given by empire. It is taken by dignity. And somewhere in Washington, a staffer whispered what many were thinking. The man didn't need our approval, and that's exactly why people listened. Traoré hadn't come to be liked. He came to be heard. In the days that followed, something unusual happened in Washington: silence. The usual pundits were quieter. The cable news chatter dimmed. And though the clips of the Traoré-Trump showdown were everywhere, few dared to directly challenge what Traoré had said. Because his words weren't just political, they were personal to millions. For the first time, a leader from the so-called Global South hadn't come to request aid, approval, or permission. He came to expose the performance. And in doing so, he'd revealed something many Americans didn't expect. A mirror. One student tweeted. Traoré didn't debate Trump. He diagnosed him. Another wrote. I didn't know who this guy was. But now I want to know why he speaks like every word costs 1,000 lives. Meanwhile, African American scholars, civil rights advocates, and even military veterans began invoking Traoré's lines in lectures and forums. He wasn't just resonating globally, he was cracking open something at home. Trump, frustrated and cornered, attempted to regain control of the narrative. In a late-night post, he declared, "This African guy doesn't know a thing about American strength. I built everything he stood in." The post was ratioed within minutes. Replies poured in. You built noise. He built silence. You chased applause. He stood in truth. He stood in your house, and he didn't flinch. At that moment, something was clear. Traoré had entered as a guest. He left as a challenge. To the system. To the stage. And to every American who still believed the world would wait politely for permission. From that point on, Traoré wasn't just a name, it was a standard. A standard for leaders who walk in without fear. And leave without asking. In the weeks after the confrontation, Traoré's name was written into speeches across campuses, chanted in protests, and dissected in think tanks. But what stunned the Washington elite more than his words, was his calm. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't thrown punches. He had simply stood, and let silence do the striking. And now, that silence was echoing through rooms that once believed they could contain power. At the Pentagon, a retired general muttered in a closed-door meeting. That boy spoke like he knew the battlefield better than us. In Silicon Valley, a group of CEOs watched the clip for the third time. One leaned forward and asked, "Do you think he rehearsed that line?" Another replied, "Does it matter? He meant every word." Even in places like the United Nations, ambassadors whispered about the incident, not in political terms, but philosophical ones. How did we miss him? Who taught him to speak like that? But the real shift happened in Africa. Traoré didn't return to parades or ceremonies. He returned to his people. And as he walked barefoot through the red soil of his childhood village, surrounded by elders, farmers, and schoolchildren, a journalist from CNN caught up with him. "Why didn't you fight back with anger?" she asked. He looked at her, tired, honest, composed. "Because anger burns too quickly. I needed something that lasts." She pressed. "What's that?" He smiled faintly. "A new standard." Traoré didn't just clap back. He reset the conversation. And as governments, media giants, and corporate titans tried to reclaim the narrative, he was already gone. Already building. In a world addicted to the loudest voice, he proved the quietest ones can reshape the room. The final blow didn't come with a microphone or a podium. It came with bricks. And books. and blueprints. As the world argued about what Traoré had said to Trump, Traoré was already breaking ground on a new university in Ouagadougou, funded not by the West, but by a coalition of African engineers, farmers, and tech minds. No IMF strings. No military flags. Just vision. Reporters kept asking. Will Traoré run for something bigger? Will he challenge global institutions? Will he build a bloc to counter NATO? He answered with action, not ambition. He didn't want to lead the world. He wanted his people to stop needing it. At the next African Union summit, several young leaders wore pins that read, "I built my own." Inspired by his quiet defiance, grassroots movements erupted across continents. In Brazil. In India. Even in small towns across the US. One American teenager posted a viral video. "I thought leadership looked like shouting into a crowd. Turns out, it might look like walking through one, without bending." Traoré's impact outlasted the news cycle. Because he never needed the world to clap. He just needed it to listen. And when Trump tried again, months later, to bait him on a global stage, Traoré declined the invitation. He sent a single sentence. "Some of us don't return to cages we've already walked out of." And with that, he moved on, leaving behind a conversation that no longer revolved around applause, but around accountability. The message was clear. The world center is shifting. And this time, it's not waiting for permission. They tried to belittle him. They tried to define him. They even tried to erase him. But Ibrahim Traoré didn't fight for applause. He didn't rise through the noise. He built through the silence. While others screamed from podiums, he carved something permanent. Not just with words, but with consequences. They called him a rebel. He became the revolution. And when the world demanded he'd know his place, he smiled and built his own. Some leaders wait for permission. Traoré never did. Because power isn't always loud. Sometimes, it just shows up, uninvited, and changes the rules.